The Army Corps of Engineers had been on the Duck River bottomland since Monday. By Thursday morning, their $510,000 Liebherr LTM 1090 hydraulic crane was listing at a 32-degree angle in 4 feet of river mud. Both near-side outrigger pads buried past the flanges, and Kyle Merritt, the project engineer from the Nashville district office, had spent 6 hours on his satellite phone looking for someone willing to pull it out. 2 commercial recovery companies had walked the site before noon and driven away. A third never came at all. That was when Wendell Pruitt pulled his 1949 Diamond T wrecker through the farm gate at the south end of the levee access road. Wendell was 72 years old. He wore a canvas work shirt the color of old concrete and steel-toed boots he had resoled twice. He had driven 14 miles from his property on Snell Hollow Road, and the Diamond T came down the field road trailing a thin diesel signature from the Straight Six. The Holmes 600 boom riding high and steady against the July sky. Kyle Merritt watched from the far side of the site with the expression of a man cataloging a problem he had not planned for. He said something to his site foreman. Both men looked at the Diamond T, and then they looked at each other. Wendell had seen that look before. He had spent a fair portion of his working life seeing it. If you appreciate stories about old iron and the men who keep it running, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read everyone. The flood mitigation job that put the Liebherr in the mud had been straightforward on paper. A 200-foot section of the West Levee, 8 miles south of Columbia in Maury County, Tennessee, had degraded after back-to-back spring floods in 2002 and 2003. Standard work, riprap placement, berm regrading, articulated concrete blanket installation along the repair bank face. The Liebherr was on its 3rd lift of the morning when the operator felt the near-side outrigger pad shift and called it over the radio. Merritt told him to complete the lift. The second call came 40 seconds later, and by then the bank had already given way. The crane dropped 11 feet off the levee crown onto the bottomland floodplain. The fall did not destroy the machine. The frame held, the boom locked, the operator climbed down unhurt. But the bottomland mud took the Liebherr the way river alluvial always takes heavy iron that hits it without preparation. Both near-side outrigger pads went in past the flanges. The cab settled 14 inches below grade. By noon, the rig was into its belly and listing hard to the right, and by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it had settled another 3 inches. Merritt called his supervisor in Nashville. His supervisor called the regional equipment manager. The regional equipment manager called the 2 largest commercial heavy recovery operations in Middle Tennessee. Dunbar Heavy Recovery out of Murfreesboro arrived Thursday afternoon with a $380,000 rotator and an operator named Folks who had 18 years in commercial recovery. Folks stood at the edge of the field, looked at the bottomland, and told Merritt that putting his rig on that ground without a bearing analysis and ground mat work would give the Corps 2 trap cranes instead of 1. 3 days minimum. Merritt said he did not have 3 days. Folks handed him a business card and drove away. Nash County Crane and Recovery came an hour later with a $440,000 Kenworth rotator unit and a foreman named Boggs who wore a hard hat with his company name in reflective letters across the front. Boggs walked closer than Folks had, studied the mud line around the Liebherr's outrigger pads, and measured the list angle before he came back to Merritt. "She's in past the pivot points on the near side," Boggs said. "Any lateral pull at this angle before you break suction, you'll shear the outrigger arms before the crane body moves. That's another $200,000 in secondary damage before you're close to a recovery." He named a standby rate and a timeline that together exceeded the Corps' authorized contingency for the entire incident. Nashville said no. Boggs drove away. The $510,000 Liebherr sat in the mud as Thursday evening came on, settling by fractions as the July ground pressed in around the outrigger pads. The standby cost to the Corps was $18,000 per day in contractor fees. By Friday morning, it had gone in another 1.5 inches. That was where things stood when Wendell came through the farm gate. He had driven past the levee access road on Tuesday out of habit, the way a man looks at a stretch of ground he has worked. On Thursday evening, coming back from the hardware store in Columbia, he had seen the Liebherr's boom at the wrong angle above the levee crown and pulled over on the highway shoulder. He had known from the angle what had happened. He had known from the address what the ground was doing. He had gone home and pulled his rigging out of the shop. Wendell had worked for the Tennessee Valley Authority for 34 years, starting in 1963 at age 23 as a ground rigger on the Normandy Dam project in Coffee County. He came up through cable work and crane rigging, trained by men who had been building this region's flood control infrastructure since the New Deal, men who pulled heavy equipment from the same bottomlands that the Corps' contractors work today. His first supervising rigger, Roy Atchley, had been doing this kind of work since 1941, and Roy communicated what he knew through demonstration rather than explanation. You watched Roy run a pro-grid or rig a 4-part block, and you learned it the way it was supposed to be learned, by watching someone who knew what he was doing until the knowledge sat in your hands the same way it sat in his. By the time Wendell took his TVA retirement in 1997, he had supervised heavy lift operations on 7 dam projects, for bridge rehabilitation contracts, and 9 emergency flood recovery jobs along the Cumberland and Duck River drainages. He had mapped sink profiles, measured bearing capacities, and documented the buried geology of this particular stretch of river bottom as part of TVA's 1981 flood risk assessment. He knew what was under the mud because he had personally run the probe transects that put it on paper in 1961 and again in 1981. Limestone does not relocate. He had bought the Diamond T in 1988 at a farm auction outside Lewisburg. The wrecker had belonged to Harlan Cobb, a retired highway crew foreman who had run it for farm recovery work since he purchased it from his brother's estate in 1961, and before that it had been Cobb Brothers Road Service operating it as a primary recovery unit from 1950 to 1983. 30 years of hard commercial work showed. The frame had been welded in 2 places. The cab carried a fold in the passenger side door from a guardrail post encounter in the winter of 1967. Wendell paid $875 for it. His wife Louise had asked him what he planned to do with a truck that old. He told her he planned to make it useful. He spent the better part of a year on the Holmes 600 boom. New travel cylinder. Repacked the slewing ring. Rewound the main drum with 200 feet of 9/16" improved plow steel cable. He rebuilt the PTO, replaced the hydraulic lines, and refaced the worm gear in the winch drive. The Diamond T's winch ran on a worm drive configuration that predated hydraulic assist by a generation. Slow, steady, without the pressure oscillations that hydraulic systems generated under maximum tension, and capable of holding load without power in a way no hydraulic winch could match. He had used that characteristic before. A county road grader from a collapsed drainage culvert outside Hampshire in 1991. A loaded log truck from a creek bottom near Santa Fe in 1995, the same creek bed that had stopped a commercial rotator 3 hours earlier. A TVA hydroelectric service crane from a soft bank near Shelbyville in 1999 pulled free on a Sunday morning because a former colleague had called and the Diamond T was the right tool for what the ground was doing. He never advertised, never put a name on the door. He helped neighbors when they called and charged enough to cover diesel and wear. Kyle Merritt met Wendell at the farm gate with his arms already crossed. Merritt was 38, 5 years with the Corps out of Vanderbilt civil program, and he carried himself with the particular certainty of a man who had always found a solution within the available equipment list. He was not unreasonable. He had run the Dunbar and Nash County scenarios correctly, understood the liability math, and made the right calls. His problem now was that he had exhausted every option that his professional world recognized. He looked at the Diamond T and then looked at Wendell. "Sir, this is an active federal project site. Do you have credentialing in heavy recovery?" Wendell Pruitt, TVA heavy lift, 34 years. Got out in 97. A pause before Merritt spoke again. "This is a private operation. We have insurance requirements." "I know that. The 2 commercial units that assessed this job yesterday both declined it. I need a licensed, bonded operator." "I'm not licensed or bonded," Wendell said. "I'm a neighbor who knows this bottomland. You want to talk about it, or you want to watch your crane settle another 2 inches?" Merritt turned and walked to his site foreman, Del Haskett, who had been on River Construction Project for 22 years and had watched the whole exchange without expression. "What do you know about him?" Haskett said he had heard the Pruitt name on this drainage. Said the man had a reputation. Said to hear him out. Merritt came back. Walk me through what you're thinking. Wendell said he needed to walk the site first. He spent 45 minutes on foot, working from the levee crown down to the bottomland, testing the ground with a steel probe rod from the Diamond T's toolbox. He moved in a grid pattern, pushing the rod in at measured intervals, reading the resistance, noting where it stopped short. Merritt followed him at 10 paces. When Wendell walked back to the truck, Merritt fell in beside him. Well, limestone shelf, Wendell said, runs at 8 feet under this section of the bottom. TVA mapped it in the 1961 drainage survey. Your crane is sitting in soft alluvial over consolidated fill over that shelf. If I approach from the right line, my truck parks on a shelf. Your truck weighs what, 22,000 pounds loaded? 24 with the rigging on board. The Liebherr is 78 metric tons. I know what it is. Merritt looked at the Diamond T, at the faded cab, the Holmes 600 boom, the hand-lettered text on the door that said Pruitt, Snell Hollow RD. That boom is 1949? Truck's 49. Holmes 600, refurbished by Holmes in Canton in 1957. It's a museum piece, Merritt said. Not cruel, just calculating out loud. Your $380,000 museum piece is back in Murfreesboro. Mine is still here. Haskett, 6 feet to Merritt's left, turned and walked toward the field trailer without a word. Merritt stood with his arms crossed. He looked at the Liebherr, and then at the Diamond T, and then at the Liebherr again. If that truck goes into the mud, that's on you. It won't go into the mud. How can you know that? Because the shelf is there, and I know where to park. Merritt said, nothing for a moment. Be back here at 6 tomorrow morning. I'll have the paperwork drawn up. That evening, Wendell drove the Diamond T back to the farm gate and parked it under a stand of cottonwoods on the levee access road. He ate a sandwich he had packed that morning and drank coffee from a thermos while the July light went low and the river sound came up through the bottomland. His neighbor's boy, Travis Lloyd, 19 years old and working for Wendell part-time that summer, sat on the running board. How come they couldn't pull it with those big rigs? Travis asked. Wendell was quiet for a moment. Because they put their biggest equipment at the problem and assumed size was the answer. The problem is not force. The problem is where you stand when you pull. The limestone shelf. The shelf. All the force in the world does not matter if the ground under your rig is softer than the ground under the load. Travis looked out at the field. You sure the shelf is still there? Wendell looked toward the levee crown, where the Liebherr's boom was just visible against the last light. It was there in 1961 when I helped run the probe transects. It was there in 1981 when I supervised the resurvey. Limestone does not relocate. Travis pulled a piece of grass. That engineer doesn't think you can do it. No. Does that bother you? Wendell thought about it. It used to, he said. He picked up the thermos and got back in the cab. If you're hooked on this story, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. These old iron stories don't show up on the algorithm easily, and your support is what keeps them coming. Thank you. Wendell was at the gate before the core crew arrived Friday morning. Air at 78 degrees and climbing, river haze still on the bottomland, the cottonwoods not yet moving. The Diamond T was running at idle, the rigging sorted and loaded in the order he would need it, each snatch block dressed and shackled. Merritt arrived at 6:08 with Haskett and 2 junior engineers and a core safety officer named Klein who had a clipboard and a laminated protocol sheet. Klein went through the protocols. Wendell listened, asked 2 questions about setback distances, and signed a modified contractor entry form Merritt had prepared. Merritt had brought someone else as well, a man named Gerald Fitch, 64, who had supervised heavy recovery operations for the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency for 22 years before retiring in 2001. Merritt had called him the night before and asked him to come watch and give an honest assessment. Fitch had driven from Nashville. He stood at the levee crown, looked at the Liebherr, looked at the Diamond T, and when Wendell walked past, he said, Pruitt, TVA flood response, Shelbyville impoundment, 1994. Wendell stopped. Gerald Fitch. Tima. That's right. You pulled a Manitowok out of a cove bank that afternoon. I was there with the county EMA. I remember the job. I told the county EMA man you'd get it. He didn't believe me either. Fitch looked at the field. Walk me through your approach. Wendell walked him through it. The probe readings, the shelf location, the 4-part block rig to a cottonwood anchor at the levee toe to build mechanical advantage, while keeping the diamond tees pull vector perpendicular to the Liebherr's list. The plan was to lift the near side outrigger pads first, break suction, then transfer a load to the far side and pull the crane body up and out. 2 hours, maybe 4, depending on what the mud gave back. Fitch listened to all of it. When Wendell finished, Fitch turned to Merritt. "Let him do it," he said. Merritt opened his mouth and then closed it. Wendell backed the diamond teed down the field approach at 3 miles per hour, Travis riding the running board watching the ground ahead. The approach took 22 minutes. He stopped twice, probed by hand, and adjusted the steering 2 to 3 degrees. The right front will punch through once, dropping 6 inches into soft fill. Travis jumped down with the probe rod. The depth was shallow. Wendell pulled forward 2 feet, probed again, and continued. When the diamond tee stopped, it was 40 feet from the trapped Liebherr. He climbed down and pushed the probe rod in directly behind the left rear tire. It stopped at 9 inches. He pushed it in on the right side. 7 inches. Limestone at both points, exactly where he said it would be. Merritt had walked to the levee toe with Fitch. Neither of them spoke. Wendell strung the 4-part block from the cottonwood anchor, 180 feet of 3/4-inch wire rope run through 2 15-ton snatch blocks to a double choker sling around the Liebherr's main frame. Travis carried blocks and shackles without being told twice. Each shackle pin was secured with seizing wire. Each choker dressed and checked. The rigging took 40 minutes. Merritt checked his watch twice. "How long has that worm drive run without a rebuild?" Merritt asked Fitch. "Don't know," Fitch said. "I rebuilt it in 1989, Wendell said from 30 feet away, not looking up from the rigging. And again in 2001. Merritt went quiet. At 8:47 a.m., Wendell climbed into the Diamond T's cab. He engaged the PTO. The worm drive winch began a turn. The wire rope across the bottomland went taut with a low, flat sound, and the Diamond T's frame settled onto its outriggers. Kyle Merritt had said to Gerald Fitch before Wendell engaged the PTO that if the old wrecker somehow got that crane free, he would authorize the consulting fee and then have the Diamond T scrapped by the weekend, because a 74-year-old wrecker pulling a $510,000 recovery was the last thing the Nashville district office needed in an incident report. Fitch had not replied. The worm drive held its load at a constant 6,200 foot-pounds. No hydraulic pressure spikes. No oscillation. The pull was even, and it held that evenness while the mud around the Liebherr's outrigger pads considered weather was ready to give. For 90 seconds, nothing visible happened. Then the near side pad shifted. A low groan from the suction below. A half-inch of lift on the outrigger flange. Then a slow, audible release as river mud found new geometry around itself. Travis said it moved. Fitch straightened slightly. Wendell held the tension. The winch turned 3 more inches of drum and stopped. Held. The near side pad came up another inch, then 2. The list angle on the Liebherr began to decrease, 1 degree at a time. Merritt had both hands in his jacket pockets. Haskett, 6 feet to his left, had taken off his hard hat and was holding at his side. The near side outrigger arm cleared the mud line at 9:11 a.m. The crane body, now supported on the far side pad only, began to track along the pull vector toward the levee toe. Mud released from around the far side pad with a sound that carried clearly to the levee crown. Wendell adjusted the pull angle 3 degrees, released 2 feet of drum, retensioned. The Liebherr moved 18 more inches. At 9:34, the crane was clear of the primary sink. Both outrigger pads were on ground above the alluvial pocket. Wendell held tension for another 6 minutes, then released the drum and shut the PTO down. He climbed out of the cab and walked to the rigging and began removing the choker slings from the Liebherr's frame. Travis helped him. Neither of them said anything for a while. Merritt walked down from the levee toe. He stood and watched Wendell pull pins. "Is it in a recoverable position now?" "The shelf held," Wendell said. He pulled the last shackle pin and started coiling wire rope. Merritt stood another moment. "How'd you know it hadn't shifted in 40 years?" "Because limestone doesn't move for reasons that show up in a project timeline. And because I walked the pro grid yesterday, and it was exactly where the 1961 survey placed it. Wendell pulled the final length of rope off the ground. TVA mapped every foot of this drainage basin. The records are in the archives in Knoxville. They have been since 1962. He said it without edge. He said it the way a man states a fact he has known a long time and no longer feels any particular need to present differently. Merritt looked at Fitch. Fitch looked back and said nothing. "How much do I owe you?" Merritt asked. "Diesel and where?" Wendell said. "Write it up as consulting." He walked back to the cab to get his thermos. The Liebherr LTM 1090 was recovered up the levee slope by 1 p.m. The Corps' own crew winched it from the crown using the machine's onboard cable. Outriggers set on 24-inch bearing pads Wendell had specified. 90 minutes of work. No structural damage beyond mud contamination and one cracked hydraulic return line, an $8,400 repair. The Nashville district office had pre-authorized a $90,000 write-down on the incident assumption. The actual cost left $81,600 unspent. Merritt filed the incident report Friday afternoon. In the recovery section, he listed the pro-grid methodology, the 1961 TVA drainage documentation, the 4-part block configuration, and Wendell's name. He sent it to Nashville as required and did not add anything to soften it. What he had not anticipated was that the Nashville district engineer, a man named Carl Sutter, who had spent his first 8 years with the Corps on TVA coordination work in the 1970s, would read the recovery section with particular care. Sutter called Merritt Monday morning and asked about the pro-grid and the 1961 drainage survey. Merritt said the field methodology had matched current Corps standards within every margin he had observed. Sutter said the TVA transect data for the Duck and Buffalo River drainages had been on the Corps' archival recovery list for 3 years, with no one able to reconstruct the original lines from the paper records alone. He asked whether the consultant might be willing to speak with the GIS and archives team. Merritt called Wendell that afternoon. Wendell said he would think about it. Gerald Fitch drove out to Snell Hollow Road the following week. He found Wendell in the shop with the Diamond T's winch drum off for inspection. They talked for 2 hours. Fitch said that in 22 years of team of field work, he had seen 3 soft ground recoveries of that type, done correctly, and had only been present for 2 of them. He said the problem with modern heavy recovery was that the equipment had outrun the knowledge base by a generation. Men who could read soft ground hydrology and build mechanical advantage without hydraulic force were not being replaced. He said the Corps interview was worth doing. Wendell agreed to it in August. He drove to the Nashville district office in the Diamond T, parked it in the Corps' equipment yard, and spent a full day with the GIS team walking back through the 1961 transect grid from memory and from notes in a survey ledger he had carried since his 3rd year with TVA. The team digitized the data. The archives section photographed the ledger. Carl Sutter came down at the end of the day, shook Wendell's hand in the parking lot, and stood for a moment looking at the Diamond T. "This is the truck that made the recovery?" Sutter asked. "Yes, sir. My first posting was the Kentucky Dam modification, 1972. We had a Diamond T on that job. I drove it twice." "Good trucks," Wendell said. They were. There were men Wendell had worked beside who would have liked to have seen that week on the Duck River bottomland. Roy actually had taught Wendell the 4-part block configuration on the Normandy Dam project in 1965. Roy spent 30 years building the rigging knowledge Wendell now carried in his hands, and he taught it the way skilled men teach, by doing the work until the student could do it without being told. Roy died in 1998. Pete Coble, Wendell's supervising engineer for 8 years at TVA, ran the 1981 resurvey of the Duck River drainage and signed off on the original transect methodology. Pete would have had something to say about the moment 2 commercial rotators drove away empty-handed, and he would have said it to no one in particular while looking at something other than the person he was addressing. Pete died in 2002. Louise Pruitt had never fully understood what the Diamond T was for. She understood that Wendell understood it, and she had left him to it with the steady faith of a woman who knew her husband's competence ran deeper than she could measure. She would not have been surprised by the Duck River recovery. She would have asked if he had eaten. Louise died in 2001. Harlan Cobb had kept careful records in a cloth-covered ledger Wendell found under the seat when he bought the truck, listing every recovery job the wrecker had run since 1950. Dates, locations, the names of whoever had called for help. The ledger ran 31 pages. Wendell had continued it. The Duck River recovery was entry 147. The Holmes 600 boom had not been young iron even when Wendell bought it. The main casting had come from the Holmes Company plant in Canton, Ohio, in 1949, built for a country that understood weight and patience and did not believe a thing was useless because it was old. The boom had outlasted 2 commercial rotators on this particular job without leaving its shed on Snell Hollow Road. The Corps archived the 1961 transect data in October of 2003. The digitized grid went into the GIS library for the Cumberland and Duck River basins. Carl Sutter included an acknowledgement in the project's summary noting that the data had been reconstructed from original field documentation held by a retired TVA supervisor. He listed Wendell's name. The Duck River levee repair was completed that fall. Wendell drove back to Snell Hollow Road and put the Diamond T under its shed. He refilled the hydraulic reservoir, dressed the wire rope with cable grease, and repacked the winch drive seals. He did this over 2 days, the way he had done after every job the truck came home from. Travis helped with the second day. The consulting check from the Corps covered 2 months of diesel and a new section of wire rope. Wendell did not frame it. Kyle Merritt sent a letter in December. Brief and professional. It acknowledged that the initial site assessment had not adequately accounted for the subsurface geology. It said the pro-grid methodology Wendell had used on site had been added to the district's field protocols for soft ground recovery operations. Wendell put the letter in the Diamond T's glove box, between Roy Atchley's 1965 rigging notes and the 1988 purchase receipt from Harlan Cobb's estate. In the spring of 2004, Gerald Fitch returned to Snell Hollow Road with 2 men, both in their 60s, both with the hands and bearing of people who had spent their working lives on job sites where things were heavy. They sat on the tailgate and talked for an hour. When they left, one of them asked if Wendell would consider running a 1-day rigging clinic for TEMA's emergency response volunteers. He ran 3 clinics that year, 6 a year after that. Travis Lloyd enrolled in civil engineering at Tennessee Tech in the fall of 2004. 2 years later, he told Wendell over coffee that he had tracked down the original 1961 TVA survey documentation in the Knoxville archives because of what he had seen on the Duck River bottomland. Wendell said that was good work. Travis said the limestone shelf data was referenced in his hydrology text. Wendell told him the shelf had been there a long time before any textbook. The Diamond T sat under its shed and waited. On cold mornings, Wendell would start it and let it run at idle for 20 minutes, listening to the straight 6 work through its cycles, watching the oil pressure climb to where it should be. He had done this for 15 years, and he did not see a reason to stop. The limestone shelf was still under the Duck River bottomland, right where the 1961 survey had placed it. He did not doubt this. Limestone does not move. Neither does knowledge if you write it down and keep the records. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. If this story meant something to you, check out the other Iron Witnesses videos on your screen now. There's plenty more old iron with stories to tell. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I'll see you in the next one.